This is Changing Denver, the show about our city, how we make it, and how it makes us. I'm Paul Caroli. These winds have been blowing east off the Rocky Mountains for a long, long time. About 70 million years, from what I've read. It was during a period of time geologists call the Laramide orogeny that the tectonic plates beneath this place shifted course, and the mountains slowly rose up to touch the sky. The first humans felt these dry easterly winds thousands of years ago as they hunted mammoths and roamed the eastern plains. White settlers first felt them around 170 years ago. They came looking for gold and found a pretty fine place to build the community that became Colorado. Since that time, our state has grown immensely. Our cities have burst at the seams, and we've sprawled across the Front Range. Millions of people now live in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. But this place, right here, appears untouched. I'm standing about 16 miles west of Denver, practically at the base of Crescent Mountain. There's a dozen or so windmills and a small mining operation off to the north. There's a housing development off to the southeast, but not much else to see but rolling grasslands in between. I came here because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is getting ready to open 5,000 or so of these acres to the public for the first time as a wildlife refuge this summer. There's going to be mountain bike trails and hiking paths and between 60 and 75,000 visitors per year. Hi. Hi, Ryan. Doing good. How are you? 2 weeks after the Fish and Wildlife Service's media relations guy, Ryan Mooring, explained to me that his boss, David Lucas, was out late the previous night tracking ferrets at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and that he slept through our meeting, I returned for a proper tour.
The winds will howl right, as they do every day. They'll come, we're not seeing it too much right now, but you'll get the typical, end of day downslope winds, and they're funneled right through.
David Lucas drove me around the refuge for about 2 hours. He pointed out where they were going to put in the trails and showed me the old Lindsay Ranch and the owl that lives inside its barn.
The folks like looking at the old barn. It's obviously got some old
oh, wow.
Some old building techniques. But, if you look up, you can see some things where we've stabilized.
He took me to the site where Fish and Wildlife wants to build a welcome center for future visitors to the refuge.
It's up there as well. It's a good spot.
And I asked him to demonstrate how to use the Geiger counter he keeps in his truck.
What's this? Oh, this is the Geiger counter?
Yeah. Pretty complicated.
What's that, four
Hold
buttons?
down to power on. No, it's pretty expensive, actually.
How much is it?
I think these are about $500 because they do both alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. So we can just leave it on. With the sun out, it's not going to pick up being hidden by the clouds. You won't get much of the background radiation that you normally see.
I was expecting clicking. Is that what happens when it... Oh, there it is.
You might be asking yourself here, why did David Lucas feel the need to spend $500 on a Geiger counter if his job primarily involves tracking ferrets, monitoring other animals and plants, and managing open spaces? Well, it's because this place wasn't always a wildlife refuge. For about 40 years, it was home to an industrial facility where thousands of Coloradans manufactured components for nuclear weapons. It was contaminated, dangerous, and extremely controversial. So what exactly is it that these winds have been blowing toward Denver? Is this place safe for mountain bikers, hikers, and, most importantly, me? And how should we contend with this still beating heart of Colorado's nuclear past? On this season of Changing Denver, we're setting out to answer those questions. Produced in partnership with the Denver Public Library and the Colorado Independent, this is Unclear Danger, the Colorado story of Rocky Flats. Chapter 1. Project Apple and the Wind. The Colorado story of Rocky Flats begins in 1949. Inside the federal government at that time, a debate was raging. 4 years prior, the United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a devastating attack that ushered in a new age of mutually assured destruction and deterrence. But in 1949, splitting the atom looked like it might not be powerful enough to keep the U.S. in control of the post-war world. The Soviet Union had just tested its own atomic bomb, and some U.S. generals and elected officials were worried. They turned to an old idea from back in the Manhattan Project days: nuclear fusion. Hypothetically, the fusion of two hydrogen atoms could produce an explosion many, many times more powerful than the super bombs that devastated Japan. And they thought that that could give the U.S. an edge. So, what to do? Well, fight about it, basically. Robert Oppenheimer, the former director of the Manhattan Project, led the opposition. He argued that fusion technology was not worth the investment, and that fission bombs would have the same effect if deployed in groups. They fought to a standstill. President Harry Truman couldn't make up his mind. This is where Colorado comes to the fore. Here's Len Ackland. His book, Making a Real Killing, is, in my opinion, the definitive history of Rocky Flats. And it's where I learned this whole story.
The two Colorado senators in those days, one Republican, one Democrat. Eugene Milliken was a Republican. The Democrat was Ed Johnson. Both sat on a 9-member Joint Committee on Atomic Energy. That committee controlled the Atomic Energy Commission's budget, so Milliken and Johnson were key players in the government's decision-making on all atomic issues. 2 out of the 9 senators were from Colorado. Well, why was that? Well, it made sense. Just like you have, if you have senators from Iowa, from the Farm Belt, they want to be on the ag committees, right? So here was Colorado, had large uranium deposits, and Milliken, a lawyer, had represented some of the uranium companies.
Colorado's uranium mining industry was primed to benefit from the industrialization of fusion bomb technology. And that may have been on Johnson's mind when he appeared on a television debate program on November 1st, 1949. The topic that night was, "Is there too much secrecy in our atomic program?" It was a pretty run-of-the-mill debate, except for one moment, when Johnson went off script and said this: "Now, our scientists already have created a bomb that has 6 times the effectiveness of the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And they're not satisfied at all. They want one that has 1,000 times the effect of that terrible bomb that was dropped at Nagasaki, that snuffed out the lives of 50,000 people, just like that. And that's the big secret that the scientists in America are so anxious to divulge to the whole scientific world." In our modern age of media manipulation and tactical leaks to the press, it's kind of funny to think about a government official leaking secret information like that directly to the American people on live TV. And again, unlike today, the effect was not immediate. There were no trending hashtags, there were no tweet storms. Instead, public pressure slowly grew on President Truman. People wanted him to pursue the hydrogen bomb and an upper hand over the Soviet Union. Ackland says that Johnson's leak wasn't that important, and that the H-bomb idea would have become public knowledge at some point. But either way, 3 months after Ed Johnson went on that TV show, Truman directed the AEC to pursue the bomb. And that necessitated a massive expansion of the nuclear weapons industrial complex. For Milliken and Johnson and other lawmakers, it represented more than $1 billion in big, juicy government contracts and the possibility of thousands of good jobs for grateful, patriotic constituents. The big prize went to Ellenton, South Carolina, in the form of a plutonium and tritium production plant. An old conventional bomb plant near Amarillo, Texas, was repurposed for nuclear weapon assembly and disassembly. Nevada was picked to host a new bomb testing site. And finally, The AEC wanted a new multi-purpose facility that could manufacture plutonium and uranium components for those bombs. The new facility would be able to convert stockpiles of old bombs into new, more deadly varieties, much quicker than the outdated facilities at Los Alamos. They wanted somewhere west of the Mississippi, north of Texas, east of Utah, and south of Colorado's northern border. The site would need a moderate, dry climate, an educated workforce, an industrial base, and a population of at least 25,000. It needed to be accessible from other AEC sites at Los Alamos, Chicago, and St. Louis, and it had to be nice enough to attract talented workers. This final piece of the nuclear puzzle went under the code name Project Apple.
March 23rd, 1951. Our top story. Good news out of Washington today. The Atomic Energy Commission announced plans this morning to build a $45 million atomic production plant just outside Denver. The site will employ thousands, AEC representatives say. According to some reports, it will be the biggest industrial operation the city has ever seen. With the Red Menace looming, the AEC is staying mum on details. But truly, it is a fine day for our mile-high city that our boys will have the chance to take up the fight from the factory floor.
Have you become more personally curious in that era since you started working here?
I grew up in Kentucky, and a lot of the same stuff was going on in Kentucky. You had the Paducah plant, you had the Bluegrass depot. A lot of the same stuff was going on there. Like I said, I think my career, what I've learned is, all the lands that we manage for parks and for wildlife into the future have a previous use. One of the first places I worked was a former mental institution, which they didn't call politically correctly. They called it an asylum. It was an old working farm, an old dairy farm, and they had the patients and inmates were out working the farm. And when that kind of stopped in the 60s, we deinstitutionalized our mental facilities, and then we had these huge chunks of real estate that we started managing as parks and places for wildlife. And I think the history of each site is so different that you do kind of have fun looking into it. I mean, while I was there, we actually had the old asylum facilities there. And talk about something that was interesting to wander about in. I mean, most of the time we spent chasing kids out of it. But, pretty unique stuff. And, like I said, I think that's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is, as we move forward, all the national parks that we have are kind of there, and, anything else that we add to our conservation estate had a former use, whether it was agriculture or industrial or an old mental institution or an old military listening station or an old, missile site. All that stuff's what's kind of being converted into the conservation estate. And I think it plays a pretty valuable role.
So there's no kids coming in here?
So far, trespassing has not been a big deal on Rocky Flats. We've had a couple of motorbikers. We've had a poacher that we dealt with in the last couple of years, but not a ton of trespass out here.
No one coming in for the thrill of being in a place where they used to make nuclear weapons?
It's just not that exciting here. Now, if they had former facilities, maybe. But I mean, you kind of walk out here as you see, and I mean, it's a whole lot of real estate. And the other thing that I've learned after doing this for decades is most of your trespassers and most of your folks that are trying to do stupid stuff are pretty lazy. If they have to walk a long way, they don't mess with it.
From the beginning of the plant's operations in 1952, they were worried about poachers of a different kind. Poachers of secrets, in particular those emanating from the Soviet Union. And that's why the AEC dictated that the contractor in charge of the plant, Dow Chemical, hire only men and women who could qualify for a top-secret Q clearance.
Rocky Flats was hiring people, we found out, especially if they had any clearances, In the military, we had clearances. Right. And that made it a little sooner because it took 6 months normally to get a clearance.
This is Kenneth Freiberg. We're hearing him now courtesy of the Maria Rogers Oral History Program, which is a project of the Boulder Public Library. Ken was hired on at Rocky Flats as a monitoring and accounting technician in 1953. He was paid $1.37 per hour.
The experience at Rocky at first was quite experienced because it was out in the middle of nowhere, basically, dirt roads. You drove up to the plant, and in turn, what you did is you parked your car outside the gates and either walked in or took a bus. There was only 2 parking areas. But at that time, the plant was pretty much just barely starting. In fact, my first job at Rocky was in Building 444.
Building 444 was where they received the plant's first shipment of uranium-238.
It was the first time we actually did any measuring of radioactive material. Took it out, we had respirators on, and in turn with the old Pee-wee instruments, we call them, which was a 26-pound instrument carried on your shoulder, we measured the alpha off of the uranium-238. And that was the first time we actually seen, and then we took smears and things to make sure we didn't spread any contamination. Right. But it was kind of a new experience.
When he says we measured the alpha, he's talking about alpha radiation. It's a type of ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation, according to the World Health Organization, is the type of radiation that has enough energy to jostle loose electrons from the orbits of surrounding atoms. Most of Ken's family thought that he was a truck driver, by the way. He spent his days working with highly radioactive materials, and even his wife didn't necessarily know what was going on out there.
In the plant, there was basically 3 main areas of radioactive materials. 444 made uranium-238 parts for nuclear weapon components. It was a machining, a foundry, mainly a foundry and a machining area. We got the material in bulk form, metal format from other sites, and then we transformed that through the foundry into components, machined it into parts, and then shipped it out to parts to be assembled for nuclear weapon parts.
There was also Building 881, where they did work with enriched uranium. And finally, the most important building, 771, where a select group worked with plutonium-239.
And a guy named I.B. Venable was the head of 771. Peg leg Venable, we call him, because he lost a leg someplace along the line.
Ken eventually moved over to Building 771 to work with Peg leg Venable. Most of his days were spent with his hands in large metal chambers called glove boxes. They were so named for the thick interior rubber gloves that allowed operators to manipulate these radioactive elements without touching them directly.
Things of this nature. But a lot of it was very, very basic manufacturing.
And was that much of that glove box work?
It was all glove box work, but some of it was even done in what we call B boxes, which were open at the bottom, and the ventilation would pull the contamination, if there was any, away from you. But in those days, we had incidents every day. Contamination every day in 771. A lot of little fires.
Did you get contaminated?
Oh, yeah.
Can you describe what that was like, maybe?
Oh, getting contaminated?
Yeah.
You don't really feel the contamination. The contamination would be like releasing dust in a room, and in turn, it gets on you as well. You then, in turn, strip your clothing, and you go from stripping your clothing to getting a shower.
And you have to do it right where you are, right?
Well, you strip the clothing normally right where you are. Normally, let's say in this room, we would have an incident. You don't want to spread it to other rooms, or you don't want to spread the contamination anyplace else. If you were to walk out of there, you would spread the contamination to the other areas. So normally you undress the person there, you clean them up the best you can right there, but then you take them to a shower, which we had in the back areas. Or in some cases, if you can't get them clean, then you still take them on up to medical.
Ken says he was probably contaminated hundreds and hundreds of times. Remember, this technology was so new. They were learning as they went. And go they did. Throughout the 1950s, the Cold War was heating up, and the demand for nuclear weapons was only increasing. The AEC kept upping its orders from Dow Chemical and the Rocky Flats plant. It put a strain on the facilities, and things started falling through the cracks. On September 11th, 1957, Room 180 inside Building 771 contained 137.5 pounds of plutonium. At around 10 that evening, hours after most of the workers had gone home for the day, a thin film of plutonium residue spontaneously ignited inside one of the glove boxes. The flame grew, and eventually the box itself caught fire. 2 guards came upon the blaze before long, and they called the fire department and started fighting the fire with carbon dioxide fire extinguishers. When that wasn't working, they had a decision to make. Water would put the fire out, but when plutonium is submerged in water, it can cause what's known as a criticality, which is exactly as bad as it sounds. The fire was getting out of control, so they took the risk. And for a while, it seemed like it was working. Pegleg Venable was at home when he got the call about the fire. He immediately ordered the firefighters to turn Room 180's fans on at high speed. They pulled smoke out of the room, but they also sucked the fire up into the air filtration system on the second floor. The firefighters didn't realize any of that was happening, and as they were suppressing the flames in Room 180, a massive explosion roared above them. The building shook on its foundation, and unfiltered, contaminated air was released into the easterly winds howling above the plant. While the exact numbers are disputed, one recent study of the atmospheric contamination that night determined that between 1.8 ounces and 1.1 pounds of plutonium was released.
After the fire, about maybe, I'd say 2-3 weeks after the fire, we were wondering how bad that was in the stack. I climbed through the ductwork, and there was about a 3-foot drop into the bottom of the stack. Went down in there, took some sand samples, and took some readings with an alpha instrument, and only got 2,500 to 3,000 counts per minute, which was very low.
At the time, they didn't think it was so bad. Not much plutonium appeared to get out, and what did get out didn't seem to get very far. So they repaired Building 771 and got back to work.
Most of the fellows felt that we were protected the best we could be, especially after a lot of us were ex-military. And when you go through the ex-military and you come in there, I didn't think it was that hazardous. We trusted our management. We felt it was one of the safest places to work. We had safety dinner dances all the time. We had safety awards all the time. Everything was safety. Yeah. If you look at some of the other plants around Denver, I won't mention them.
This account of the September 11th fire is largely drawn from Len Ackland's book, Making a Real Killing. Ackland says that it's not exactly clear what caused the explosion, but that it was likely the combination of volatile gases and dust that had been gathering on the air filters. According to Ackland's research, those filters hadn't been changed in 4 years. Dow Chemical and the Atomic Energy Commission conducted an internal investigation into what happened that night, and according to Ackland, their reports hinted at deeper systemic problems and broader environmental contamination. But again, the Cold War was on. Less than 2 months after the fire, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, and the dog Laika became the first living creature in space. The communist threat was growing, so production didn't slow down, and more safety awards were distributed. Outside the plant, none of this was known. The local press covered the fire, but no reporter pursued the question of contamination. It was a blip. Business as usual.
Okay. Got it? Yeah. I don't see any concrete slabs like you mentioned. Is it just pretty far in there?
You wouldn't see them. They're under the ground.
Oh.
You would not, if you and I drove out there in the middle, which you can try to schedule that if you want with Department of Energy, you won't see anything. It's the slabs that were left out there were simply left out there because of employee safety in terms of getting them out. If they dug 30, 40 feet down and then they, hit the bottom of a basement, they want to put 30 or 40 feet of soil on top of it, that was deemed okay. You might risk your workers more trying to pull out a slab in that kind of environment. And it sounds like you've done some of your research, but most of the residual contamination that occurred out here was from a thing called the 903 pad, which was an area that they stored some drums that had lubricating oil in it that also had radioactive, pieces of material in them. And then, like all those drums that we've seen across time, they started to leak. Then the wind picked that up and blew that contaminated soil. That's where 99% of any contamination came from. Once they were aware of it, they paved it and didn't make sure the soil didn't blow. But I think that was one of the bigger parts of their whole cleanup effort, was dealing with that wind-blown contamination.
Sounds complicated.
Does to me too.
Wind blowing it in the old place. Although maybe you can track that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the best things about these Superfund sites is that you actually know everything. It's been highly studied. We got plenty of places on the planet that we have no earthly idea what went on there. The soil sampling that they did out here, I think, was pretty darn intense, and was able to, identify and isolate and, figure out where the problems were and where the problems weren't. And go after it.
After the 57 fire, Dow Chemical and the AEC did take some precautions to maintain worker safety. Throughout the 1960s, they adopted new processes, expanded the plant, and adapted existing systems to build new types of bomb components. The emphasis was always on speed, though. Dow's contract incentivized production above all, so accidents continued to happen. There were small fires, there were niggling issues that never got the attention they deserved. There was the 903 pad that David Lucas mentioned. Then, on Mother's Day, 1969, everything changed. It was another fire, a big one this time. Plutonium shavings inside a glove box in the new building 776-777 spontaneously combusted. 41 firefighters, guards, and other plant personnel sustained radiation doses before they were able to contain the fire that evening. The AEC estimated that the lost plutonium, recovery costs, and the damage to the buildings themselves amounted to almost $71 million. But the material cost was only part of the story. Unlike the 57 fire, the 69 fire was visible off-site. For the first time, residents of Denver, Boulder, and the rest of the Front Range had reason to suspect something potentially dangerous was happening out at Rocky Flats. A spate of newspaper stories about the fire prompted a group of scientists in Boulder to conduct an independent investigation into environmental contamination. Led by a member of the Colorado Committee for Environmental Information, called Ed Martell, they found evidence that contradicted the assurances coming from the AEC and Dow, and public scrutiny increased. The Jefferson County Health Department ran a study of its own. The state government got involved. Watergate-wary citizens started organizing in defense of the environment and against nuclear war. The AEC later replaced Dow Chemical as lead contractor with Rockwell International, but it was too late. By the time the 1974 election rolled around, Rocky Flats was firmly in the domain of politics, with all the complications and bureaucracy that entails. Democrats made huge gains that year. They picked up 4 seats in the Senate, 4 governorships, including in Colorado, where Dick Lamb unseated Republican John Vanderhoof, and 49 seats in the House of Representatives, including Colorado's District 2, where the young and charismatic Tim Wirth defeated the incumbent Republican in a race to represent the area spanning Boulder, some of Denver's suburbs, and the Rocky Flats plant. And Lamb and Wirth, they were close. 2 months after the election, they shared a flight to a Democratic Party convention in Kansas City. Here's Tim Wirth, speaking in an interview from the Maria Rogers Oral History program.
And I remember sitting on the back of the plane, we were both talking about Rocky Flats and what we ought to do, and at that point we just dreamed up the idea, well, why don't we get a group of people together in Kansas City.
That idea eventually became the Lamb-Wirth Task Force on Rocky Flats. It was the first ever citizen oversight of the plant, and its 11 members were tasked with studying the plant's operations and evaluating its safety.
It's very important to understand what we were saying. it isn't the odds, it's the stakes. A lot of times in public policy, even small odds are unacceptable.
This is Dick Lamb, speaking decades after the formation of the task force.
There was an awareness that if anything went wrong out at Rocky Flats, and things did go wrong, but anything that really got away, like a fire almost got away, that the stakes of something like this were such that even small odds were unacceptable.
Lamb supported the nuclear weapons program. He understood the need for a plant like Rocky Flats. He and Worth just didn't understand why it was built so close to Denver and Boulder. And that's actually one of the big things they wanted the task force to figure out.
But one of the most important meetings that happened before the task force actually started working together.
This is William Cohen, a lawyer who represented Worth on the task force. Early on in his term, Worth invited Cohen along to a meeting with a high-ranking representative of the Energy Research and Development Administration, which had recently taken over for the Atomic Energy Commission. It was informal and casual. Worth just wanted to get to know the people he'd be dealing with.
And it was a very nice, cordial conversation, and at some point, I can't remember how it came up, this gentleman mentioned that there had been a siting study done as to where to site this plant, this nuclear weapons manufacturing plant. And they had several places around the country. They narrowed it down. They narrowed it down to Denver. And we said, we would like a copy of that.
Oh.
And he said, I'm paraphrasing, well, it's classified, but I think I can get you one. And one of my first jobs was to kind of keep the pressure up to get it, and we got it. And I think that was one of the pivotal moments in the whole process, because what we found was they had used criteria which was false. The biggest point being, they said the plant was leeward, meaning sheltered from the major population area, which it was not. And they said the prevailing winds were from the south. And we all know that they're from the west, yes, which meant that any plutonium that escaped would get blown towards Denver.
And that was just the first huge secret they uncovered. The Lamworth Task Force investigated all sorts of things. The 903 pad, the 57 and 69 fires, and they found a cornucopia of other major issues. Like, just 1 year before the task force convened, they learned that a leak of tritium, a highly toxic element, was found in the Broomfield water supply. They also engaged with the public. The housing developments between Denver and Boulder had inched closer and closer to the plant over the past 20 years, and no one really understood what was happening in there. People were scared of the plant and how it might be affecting them. And without any source of reliable information, paranoia reigned.
We had first public hearings, and they were somewhat helpful. They were somewhat amusing. We had a farmer come in and display to us, I think, pictures of a two-headed calf, and claim this was caused by drinking the water from Great Western Reservoir. Well, we had no way of evaluating if that was actually true or not. But we had a lot of people from the area who were living in the vicinity of the plant come and tell us their concerns.
The task force delivered its final report in October 1975. It contained a slew of recommendations across 16 major themes, and that included a call to reprogram the plant for, quote, less hazardous uses of energy. The task force believes that any burden of proof rests with the ERDA in Rockwell to guarantee the health. It seems certain that if the criteria evaluated for the original siting of the RFP were applied for siting today, the Permanent Monitoring Committee should be established to continue the work. Congress and the President of the United States should reassess the Rocky Flats plan, a comprehensive and independent epidemiological study that they will provide speedy, accurate, and detailed information concerning all radiation accidents. The federal government should acquire land for an additional buffer zone around the plant. Universities, public schools, and state and local health departments should be charged with the responsibility and provided with the funds to educate the workers at Rocky Flats and the public about the short-term and long-term effects of plutonium. Some of these recommendations were taken into account. Others were ignored and forgotten. But by laying out the problems in plain language and in public, the report kicked off a new phase in the history of Rocky Flats. It fueled even greater anti-war and environmental protests, galvanized the union that represented workers at the plant in defense of their jobs, and set the stage for a dramatic confrontation in the 1980s. But before we get there, we're going to take a quick break for a word from one of the other members of the Denver Podcast Network.
Every week, Denver's own Real Nerds Podcast sees a new movie and we podcast our experience to the world.
I think sometimes we're funny.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm talking, not when you're talking, not when you're talking.
Oh,
you know, it might help if you told them that we're on iTunes or we're on Stitcher so they could find a place where they can actually listen to us.
Oh, okay, Brad. We're also on Twitter at Real Nerds, and we have an Instagram account. Boom. Commercial, Brad. Cut, paste, upload. We like to have fun.
Sure. I like fun.
James, you're very bad at improv. RealNerdsPodcast.com.
So we're standing on xeric tallgrass prairie. The reason it's called xeric is for a lot of reasons, but xeric obviously means dry, and it contains a whole bunch of tallgrass species. But if you look down, you can just see probably hundreds of different species of grass and forbs, yuccas, cactuses, all just at our feet as we just walk around out here. But then we're standing now and we're going to overlook what's called the Rock Creek drainage. The headwaters of the Rock Creek are on the refuge to our southwest, and then this leads all the way up through Boulder, eventually down into the Platte River. And what you see down here is some of the terrain. Those are 200-foot cottonwood trees that we're looking down on, but they look rather small. But what you can also see is what's happened here. This Rocky Flats alluvium is up top, and water's carving its way through here over hundreds of thousands of years, and it creates seeps. When the water seeps through those rocks, it eventually hits a clay layer, and then it pushes out. And that's where you're seeing, these shrubs and even some cattails along the sides of these drainages. Riparian corridors are of huge importance to wildlife. Historically, 98% of the Great Plains was grass, 2% was these riparian corridors. Riparian corridors have been lost over time for lots of different reasons and fragmented, but they provide a huge resource to wildlife. I mean, number one, the travel corridors. They provide habitat for a lot of different species, but number two, it's where the water is, and water is essential to all life.
I'd like to introduce you to someone. Her name is Jackie Braver.
Well, let's see. I was born in Sparta, Wisconsin on June 19th, 1957.
Her dad was in the military, and her family moved around a lot when she was young. But by the time she was 11, they had settled here in Colorado. She grew up here in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. She went to school here. She fell in love here. She had her first child here. Shortly after she gave birth, Jackie broke up with the father. They still got along, though, and when he told her he got a good-paying job out at Rocky Flats, she decided to put in an application of her own. She started in the cafeteria. Then, when she had taken enough chemistry, physics, and algebra classes to qualify for the right security clearance, they brought her on as a chemical operator. She was making good money. It was 1984.
In chemical operator basic training, I had no idea until I was actually in the process area that it was bad. In fact, my whole training, I thought that it was like a little lab. I did. I thought it was just not a little lab, a big lab. That's what I thought. I thought we made nicey with little bottles of flasks, and that's what I really thought until I actually, my first day in that building, walked in the door in that room in 771. And I looked all around and there was brutalism architecture. Piping everywhere, tanks and glove boxes, and I looked in there, it took my breath away. I thought, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? This is a factory.
The Rocky Flats of the 80s was a far different place from the state-of-the-art facility it was back in the 1950s. The plant was embattled, with activists on one side, politicians on another, journalists constantly prying and pressing for access, and new environmental regulatory agencies like the EPA closing in. On top of all that, the facilities themselves were aging, and in many cases, severely out of date. Listening to Jackie Braver and other interviews from the Maria Rogers Oral History program, I get the sense that there was a general feeling of us versus them pervading in the plant at this time. And also that not everybody got to be part of the us.
And
were you the only woman? Or
no, there were a few of us, but they just did not want us there. And they had their little club and women were invading it. And so I was asking him, how do you do that? Because, it's trial by fire in there back then. They said, here you are, you're trained, you know how to wear your respirator, go. And
Jackie was an outsider. She complained too much about safety issues, and basically, they didn't let her in the club.
And the particular area they assigned me to first, that man was truly mean to me. Truly mean. And I said, but there were procedures on the glove boxes and nuclear criticality limits and for spacing and stuff. And so I was reading all this, and he's working frantically, being all dramatic and flipping this and turning that and showing off. And I said, well, look, it says here in the procedure you're supposed to do such and so. And he said, well, that might be what it says in there, but that's not how it is in the real world. And he told me to go away and leave him alone. And I was assigned there. And so, of course, my feelings were a little dampened. And so I said, all right, screw it. And I bought a little black notebook. And I started taking notes.
She recorded everything in that notebook. Safety concerns, descriptions of how things were actually done compared to how they were supposed to be done. Other things, too. It sounds to me like this notebook became something of a respite for her amid a truly hostile work environment.
Oh my gosh, you had to be so tough. I came in there like totally sweet, innocent, naive, and peaceful and happy. And man, when I got in there after a while, I was a mean bitch. If you would have known me back then, you would not like me, because you had to be to survive. I was mean. I'm ashamed of how I was, but that's how you had to do it. And I ended up getting physical a couple times. Because I don't like people touching me. And unless I choose to hug them or something. But when you're in the gloves and you're trapped, sometimes bad stuff happens. And so yes, there was a lot of sexual harassment.
Imagine that. You're working in a glove box. You're trying to focus on the deadly chemicals and radioactive materials you're working with. Your hands are basically stuck inside this device. You're defenseless. While Jackie was struggling to get by on the inside, powerful forces were mustering outside the plant. Local politicians were talking about an expensive cleanup. The Department of Energy, which had taken over administration of the country's nuclear complex, was distancing itself from Rockwell. The EPA made a very critical report after a tour of the plant in 1988. The Sierra Club filed a lawsuit in early 1989 alleging environmental crimes and malpractice. People across Colorado were waking up nearly every day to news stories in the Post or the Rocky Mountain News about environmental contamination and bureaucratic malfeasance at Rocky Flats. Among them was an FBI agent named John Lipsky. He and a small team quietly started collecting information, contacting people discreetly, and reviewing historical documents. By 1987 and 1988, Lipsky's curiosity had morphed into a full-fledged joint FBI-EPA investigation. On the nights of December 9th, 10th, and 15th, 1988, Lipsky flew a spy plane over the plant. Rockwell and the DOE had agreed to shut down the incinerator in Building 771, but but Lipsky suspected that they were surreptitiously burning plutonium late at night. He took infrared photos that ultimately vindicated his suspicions. 6 months later, on June 6, 1989, Lipsky led more than a dozen FBI and EPA agents out to the plant. It was the first time in U.S. history that one federal agency had raided another.
So then the FBI was raiding the plant on June 6th. I was going to the dentist. I thought, well, this is cool. I gotta go back to work and see what's going on. And they were all over that place, crawling everywhere. They knew what offices to go to, what managers to throw out of their offices, what documents to seize, what buildings. They had their own jumpsuits, their own instruments, and nobody knew what was going on. The management was frantic. They were running around like chickens with their heads cut off.
Jackie went home, took some time to figure out what was going on, consulted with her friend and colleague, Karen Pitts, and ultimately made a decision. She clutched her notebook and called the FBI.
I had 95 interviews with those FBI, and they are just like in the movie.
25 interviews.
Over 3 years.
Over 3 years.
Over 3 years. And they would not let me loose. They interviewed me. Oh, and when they found out I had a journal, oh my gosh.
Jackie and Karen cooperated with the FBI and their Justice Department lawyers. They later testified in front of a grand jury that they had operated the incinerator in Building 771 late one Sunday night around Christmas time in 1988. As you can imagine, that didn't win her any friends with the other workers out at the plant. Production had halted after the raid, but the union and Rockwell were still heavily invested in the continued operations in some form.
And I found a memo from a high-level manager, high-level Rockwell manager, with my badge picture, my name, my address, my phone number, and a memo for him to keep eyes on me. And he wasn't hiding. He was hiding before he let me know he was there. Because the day that he chased me on the highway, he was sitting right across the street in front of my house. He wanted me to see him.
1989 slipped into 1990. 1990 slipped into 1991. The litigation trudged on, and Jackie was worried about her daughter.
It was in Jess. Little Jess had gone to daycare with all these kids. They grew up together since they were babies in the daycare. And all of a sudden they're saying mean stuff to her because their parents are coming home and talking about it. And the teacher, one of her teachers, she was getting a drink of water one day, and one of her teachers came up and said, "Don't do that. If that water's poisoned, then your mom did it." And she fled out of the school and fled home. And she wouldn't play outside. She wouldn't go outside. Oh, it was so bad. And, gosh, I almost made it all the way through without getting emotional. But it's my kid, so it affects me worse. Me, it's okay, they poisoned me, but they hurt my kid. And, so it was pretty bad. I wasn't sleeping, and I was working and trying to put up with their crap. They deleted all my computer files.
On March 26, 1992, the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News reported that the Justice Department had reached a settlement with Rockwell and ended the investigation. The contractor pled guilty to 10 environmental crimes and agreed to pay an $18.5 million fine. If you want another perspective on the trial and more detail about this settlement, I first read about Jackie's story in a book called The Ambushed Grand Jury. We've got a link to a PDF version of that book on our website. In it, Jackie recounts her disappointment and suspicion about the settlement. It made no mention of the incinerator, and she saw it as a cover-up. But at the same time, she couldn't see any way to do anything about it. So she packed up Jess and all their belongings and started out west on the I-70. No destination in mind, anywhere but here. After a day of driving, they stopped at a hotel in Grand Junction.
Walked out that night of the hotel room, and I saw the most incredible thing. I had never in my life seen mesas. In all my traveling all around the world, I never saw mesas. the rock, red, pink, orange sunset on the the monuments, the Colorado National. I'd never seen that, and it took my breath away. And I stayed there till it just wasn't anything to look at anymore. And then I hurried the next morning to go watch it again, and
A few years after moving to Grand Junction, Jackie started a 2-decade-long battle with various cancers and respiratory issues. She died in October 2015. She was 58 years old. Back on the Front Range, Rocky Flats was in a new era of uncertainty. With the raid and the litigation and the settlement, and most importantly, the recent collapse of the Soviet Union, no one really knew if or when operations would restart. Then, in January 1992, in his State of the Union address, President George Bush put an end to all that.
2 years ago, I began planning cuts in military spending that reflected the changes of the new era. But now, this year, with imperial communism gone, that process can be accelerated. Tonight, I can tell you of dramatic changes in our strategic nuclear force. These are actions we are taking on our own.
The Cold War was over. There was no more need for Rocky Flats. Project Apple was over. The DOE and the EPA ended their adversarial relationship and became partners, along with the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, on a massive cleanup. They brought on a new contractor, Kaiser Hill, and engaged with local governments, activists, and environmental groups. 10 years and more than $7 billion later, on October 13, 2005, Kaiser Hill certified that the cleanup was complete. 21 tons of plutonium and highly enriched uranium had been shipped to other DOE facilities. 800 structures were cleaned up and removed. 421 areas of known or suspected contamination were investigated and remediated as needed. The DOE certified the cleanup and in 2007 transferred control of the buffer zone surrounding what is known now as the Central Operable Unit to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that brings us to today.
So you get a pretty good view of the old inside now. So you can see there's one shed there, and then there's the identical shed that you and I drove past on the other side. Those were installed after 9/11 to inspect vehicles during cleanup. Give them a place to drive a car in if they needed to inspect a vehicle in the wind or the winter. And those have been held on to because they're a pretty decent storage building. There's one there, and then there's one on the other side that we'll drive past. Those are the only two buildings out here. Man, these elk are giving us a run for our money, aren't they?
Elusive. They've proven elusive. What's the most exciting part of this project?
Well, I mean, the nuclear weapons era is, it's one of those points in our human history, None of us love war. None of us love conflict. There's been Nobel laureates that have talked about that, as much as we don't want to have nuclear weapons, that genie's out of the bottle. That's an era. And a lot of people worked very hard here to protect our country, which I think is an important part of history. And then when that mission was over, a whole lot of people came out here to try to figure out how to kind of clean up the damage that was done. And I think they did a great job with it. So, I think, any piece of land that we're looking at in the Front Range of Colorado has been used by somebody. We don't have wilderness in the Front Range. And, I think that, whether we're up the hill up there and we're looking at, old abandoned mines, or whether we're down the hill here and we're looking, at former homestead sites, or whether we're looking at former industrial areas, it's all a part of our history. And I think we use these lands to learn a lot of things. We learn about our history, and we use that history to not make the same mistakes again. We also use that history to inform our decisions as we move down the road. But I also think it's pretty impressive that we can look at lands like these and see that nature can heal, and that it is possible to protect places, as we continue to grow as a human population. That's a lot, sorry.
No, that's great. That's why I'm here. It's an interesting story.
Yeah, that's why you ask what we think about when we're out here. We think about wildlife, we think about habitat, and we think about the history. And we think about where we're going together as a United States, and these places are important. They will be here. This place will be here forever and protected as it is forever, and that's unique and that's important as we move along.
When you listen to David Lucas talk about healing and protection, it sounds like the problems are long over. But here's the thing. I didn't come out here to Rocky Flats just because this story is so compelling. I needed to feel the wind, to visit the remnants of Project Apple for myself, and to see the power of this place. Because there's an important part of this history that I left out, and that David doesn't really like to talk about. See, what you heard over the last hour or so was, for the most part, the official history of Rocky Flats. But in the nooks and crannies, in the shadows beneath the official proclamations and reports, there's a whole separate story running parallel. It started in the early 1970s with the anti-war and environmental activist movement, and it has continued in some form all the way through to today. You can't hear it now, but if you do as I have done over the past year and a half, and visit the right library meeting rooms and church basements, if you listen to the right people on local school boards, in former governor's offices, and local public health departments, you can hear it. A cacophony of distrust, suspicion, and doubt.
Glad that I don't live near Rocky Flats down in the Colorado hills. There ain't no warning signs near Rocky Flats talking about that nuclear pill.
On Rocky Flats, I have just found it too convenient that there's just no problem here. Look somewhere else.
There's a lot of money at stake. Let's open the site, let's open the site. No, let's not open the site. We cannot guarantee that it's safe for kids, people, hikers, bikers, whatever, to go on that site.
Kids, I have grandkids, I have great-grandkids. And when I think about a child going out there, we want them to grow up healthy and thrive. We don't want them to have leukemia.
I mean, the question of clean is such a relevant thing. And I guess I'm naturally suspicious when I hear an announcement like that. That I would just simply color me skeptical.
Why risk it? There are plenty of places to hike in Colorado. Gorgeous, gorgeous places. Let's just keep this one closed and protect our health.
I hope Nick heard some of that, right? Now keep it up, everybody.
Next time on Unclear Danger, the Colorado story of Rocky Flats, a people's history of the plant. Who are these activists? What exactly do they want? Why? And can they get it? Changing Denver is a proud member of the Denver Podcast Network. In the shadow of the mountains,
we speak.
This fourth season of Changing Denver is being produced in partnership with the Denver Public Library and the Colorado Independent. You can learn more and hear past episodes at coloradoindependent.com. Special thanks this time to Len Ackland, David Lucas, Ryan Mooring, and Sins Nelson. The interviews you heard in this episode with Ken Freiberg, Dick Lamb, Tim Worth, William Cohen, and Jackie Braver were clips from extended interviews at the Maria Rogers Oral History Program. We'll put links to those specific interviews on our website, changingdenver.com. Thanks also to Tina Grigo at the Colorado Independent, Jenny LaPerriere at the Denver Public Library, Dave Ashton and Maeve Conran at KGNU, JD Lopez, who voiced the radio announcer you heard in this episode, Tommy Chelston, who allowed us to use his recording of the protest song you heard just a minute ago, Kat Jaffe and Matthew Simonson, who provided some clutch audio engineering skills, and of course, Megan Ariano. Music for this episode and all of Unclear Danger was provided by Ethernaut and Michael Zucker. Our theme song is Minnow by Felix Fast Forward. I'm your host, Paul Caroli. If you can't wait for episode 2 of Unclear Danger, and you're interested in hearing other perspectives on the history of the Rocky Flats plant, We're hosting a free event at the Denver Public Library this coming Saturday, April 7th at 2 p.m. It's a panel featuring the aforementioned Len Ackland, Dorothy Ciarlo, who conducted many of the oral histories you heard in this episode, and Murph Widdowfield, a former worker at the plant who's been trying for years to build a Rocky Flats Cold War History Museum. So, April 7th, 2 p.m., the 7th floor of the Central Branch of the Denver Public Library. See you there.